Hello friends! We're on a quest to raise the percentage of players that have beaten Oxygen Not Included, which means they completed the final objective by sending a rocket to the temporal tear without using sandbox tools or debug commands. We started at only 1.4%, and I need your help to raise that number. This video and many others will be dedicated to helping players finish the game, and if you do, you can send me your save file using the form in the description, and I may show it off in an upcoming video. With that said, let's get started. Hello friends! Today we're going to be tackling a subject that is often requested in comments, and one that I've talked about before, but we're going to try to make it more simple and concise and show some basic builds that you can implement in your own games as soon as possible. Of course, the topic we're going to be covering is automation, but we'll wind up splitting it into a few different videos, increasing in complexity as we go. If you only need to know the basics, then you're in the right place. The first part of automation that you need to know is that the only purpose behind automation is to turn things on or off when you want them to be on or off, but usually without you needing to pay attention to it. Some examples could be turning off a water vent to make sure it doesn't overfill a pit, or turning on a gas pump when it's covered in duplicant farts. The second thing that you need to know is that automation requires two objects interacting with each other, one that sends the signal to turn something on or off, and another to receive the signal and turn on and off when something tells them to. The signal switch is the sender of the signal, and the light bulb is the receiver. They're wired together using automation wire. You can use these signal switches to manage a lot of buildings in the game, and the best part about them is that outside of building the parts, you don't need to wait for your duplicants to enable or disable these buildings. If you find yourself using this command, see if the building has an automation port and just wire it up to a signal switch. You can also use this to force doors to always be open or closed if you want duplicants, critters, or other objects to be able to pass freely into another area, or not. Ultimately, you could run an entire base using nothing but signal switches and manually turning everything on and off when you need to, but the problem is that you'll eventually be juggling hundreds of switches and it'll only be a matter of time before you forget to turn something on or off that's important. Instead of signal switches, there's a whole list of sensors that will detect certain things and send the signals to other things to turn them on or off. And I'll cover a bunch of the more common ones, but feel free to experiment with these and see if there's any combinations that would help you out in your run. Okay, let's actually get into game now and talk about some real builds that you could use, and we'll start with the most simple one that we can. So we just talked about lights, and obviously you'd want lights to only be on when there's a reason to have them on. So let's take a look at the duplicants here. They're all doing some stuff, they're generating power, they're making some food, they're doing some research. But they will go faster if they are in a lit area. And there is no natural light on the map. There is some from like critters and from the printing pod and a few other places, obviously out in space. But normally there's not really light. But if you add lights, then your duplicants will work faster. So let's add some ceiling lights to a couple of their workstations and see the bonus on them to see how much faster they go. So there we go. Now that they're in a lit workspace, you will see the bonus on them. It says lit workspace, plus 15% speed. Like I mentioned though, these lights are just going to be constantly using power, and there's a bunch of things that'll be constantly using power unless you actually need them to be on. So let's make some automation to turn them off. So we have a sensor in here that's going to be detecting duplicant motion. Basically, if a duplicant is in the area, these things will activate, and we can wire these up to the lights so that they're only being used at times that duplicants are actually in the area. So these two duplicants are getting the bonus. We're not running this light because we don't need to. Nobody's working over here right now. So that is definitely a good way to save power on lights. Another reason why you might want to do this is if you have a duplicant that is afraid to sleep in the dark, you could set up something like this next to their bed as well. Just kind of want to make sure that it doesn't spill over into other people's beds that don't like it. But that's an easy way to deal with that downside. Okay, here's a cool slush geyser. Geysers and vents and that kind of stuff are the things that you want to capture later in the game so that you get a bunch of free resources from them. But there is a little bit of automation that'll help out when you're capturing these things, and I'll talk about these in a lot more detail in a separate video. But the basic point is that these will eventually erupt and put out some resources. Cool slush is basically just polluted water, so let's put a pump down here. I'll put up a couple of placeholder power generators. This is just like a sandbox only thing so that we don't need to wait for anything to provide any power for us. So I'm going to put a pump down here, and we'll put a reservoir or two to pump this into. So there we go. And we'll connect it up like this. And once we have it, the pump is going to start running, and it will pump all the polluted water somewhere that we actually want. But what can eventually happen is we will stop pumping very efficiently. We'll get these smaller packets in here, meaning that we're still spending full power on this pump, but we're not getting as much water out of it that we might want. This doesn't seem like a big deal, but if you have like 5 or 6 of these, it can really start adding up. So we're getting pretty bad performance on this pump right now, considering we're pumping out like less than half or barely any water sometimes when this thing runs, but it's still using the full 120 watts. So let's put this on a hydro sensor and have it only turn on if there's enough water here to have it make sense to actually pump out. So the hydro sensor has some settings on this, and it's going to say send a green signal, which we've established means it's going to turn something on, if these conditions. So if we want to make sure that it's going to be pumping out when it's actually worthwhile, we're going to set it to something like send a green signal only if it's above, like, I don't know, 50 kilograms or something like that. That way, your pump will just remain off up until you have the right water pressure to actually make it worthwhile to pump this out. There's a couple other examples that'll be really handy for stuff like this. I'm trying to get this to speed up so that we can actually see this. Maybe above, like, I don't know. Let's just say 40. That should be fine. So now when it's above 40, the hydro sensor is going to allow the pump to turn on. And outside of the first and last packets, it will pump out full packets, and we can guarantee that. There's some other automation you can use to make this a little bit more efficient, but even this alone is already going to be saving us a lot of power when we're taking these geysers, and I'll talk about a natural gas geyser as well, since that's something you'll also want to get. Alright, here we have a natural gas geyser that we're pumping the natural gas out from because it is a very useful power source. But this is the same issue as we just talked about, but it's probably worse because the gas pumps take more power and they will stay on for longer. So you can see this room is getting down into very low pressure, and we're still paying the full amount of power to run this pump, but it's pumping out these really tiny packets. So in order to make sure that this is only running when it's worthwhile, I'm going to put this on an Atmo sensor, which checks the air pressure on this tile. And I'll connect it up to my pump. And I'm going to say I only want to pump this out if this is above, like, I don't know, 400 grams or something like that. Just to make sure that this pump is only running when there's enough gas pressure to make the spending the power on it actually worthwhile. So while the air pressure is very low, this is not going to be pumping at all because there is no reason to spend the power on this until it's dense enough to actually start running. Once we start hitting those levels, you can see that all the packets are basically full, at least full for what this one pump can push. One gas pump can only push about 500 grams through a pipe at a time. But we're getting only full packets, and we're only running this, like, you know, less than half the time, because for the most part, this is only erupting about half the time, and even the amount this can pump out is not quite as much, or rather is more, than this natural gas can put out at a time. So definitely a big power saver there, especially because the whole point of taking natural gas geysers is to get power in the first place, so you might as well not waste it. Okay, here's another power saver. This one is going to be about shipping, and we'll cover shipping in a lot more detail in a different video, but let's say your duplicants dug out a whole big area and there's a bunch of supplies here that are very useful, like coal for generating power, or let's say there's dirt that you're using to grow some food or something like that, and I want to ship this all back, but I don't want to have duplicants run over here and do it themselves. So what I could do, and what would take a lot of time, is something like this. Let's say we have an automatic dispenser or a storage bin or something like that, and we're like, hey, go get all this stuff for me and bring it back. This is an extremely slow way to do this. I wouldn't normally want to do this, but I could tell my duplicants to say, hey, move all this stuff back here for me. But if there's tools that can do this for us and not have our duplicants have to go do it themselves, let's use that. So let's set up a very quick and dirty shipping system. So set up an auto sweeper and range of all these things, and they're going to load the stuff into a conveyor loader. The conveyor loader is basically going to put stuff on rails so that whatever is swept up can be moved to another location using these rails. So I'm going to drop some conveyor rails here. Let's say we ship it to the middle of the base. Sure. Let's run some power over here. So there we go. And now that these are all set up, this conveyor loader is going to be asking for everything. So whatever these auto sweepers can find, it's going to load in here. But again, this is the same problem as the gas pumps, or the liquid pumps for that matter. This is spending full power every time, moving only 80 kilograms of material at a time. But the issue here is that this can hold about 1,000 at a time, so we might as well get a little bit more efficient with this. And the way I'm going to do this is with a timer sensor. So I'm going to put a timer sensor on here, and I'm going to wire it up to the 2 auto sweepers. Something like this. Timer sensors have 2 points here. It's basically how long do you want it to stay on, and then how long do you want it to stay off, and it's just going to constantly rotate back and forth between these two. For the on time, let's say like 15 seconds, and for the off time, let's say like, I don't know, 60. So I'm going to reset the timer, and what it's going to do for those first 15 seconds is it's going to let the auto sweeper run. Then once we start getting into the red, it's going to turn it off, and it's going to let the conveyor loader continue to unload, but we don't need to continue to spend power on these auto sweepers because they're not really doing anything right now until this is actually empty. Oh, nice, we're out of power. We'll add a debug generator here just to keep this running. So once we get up to the green part, we can see that the conveyor loader is now empty and it needs more stuff. So we're at the timing that this is about ready to turn back on and load this back up. And it's going to pick up huge packets this time. So it's going to pick up like 920 kilograms, a couple of 80s. But this is only on like, you know, not 10% of the time. Like a fifth of the time is how it's tuned right now. It could be more or less depending on how many auto sweepers you have targeting the same conveyor loader. But these can be very expensive power-wise, and there's no reason to spend the power if they're not actually doing anything a lot of the time. I might need to tune this up or down to get it perfect, but I think you get the idea. Alright, another very simple concept, but I think it's worth mentioning. Let's say we have an area that is extremely hot, or it's filled with gases that we don't want to mix with the gases in our normal base. What we're going to do for this is we're going to create a liquid lock. And I'll create an entire video about this because these are very useful, and there's some nuance to them, but just for the sake of example, let's just go with a very simple one. A liquid lock is basically a way to add liquid to an area to make sure that gases don't transfer between 2 areas. So it could be like your entrance into space or something like that too, or entrance to a steam room or something like that. So what you might do is you might bring over some water. I have some salt water in here just to fill this up, but just to make sure that we don't overfill it or that there's some kind of issue with it, we could put a hydro sensor here in the middle, connect it up to the vent, and only allow the vent to be open if we're like below 500 kilograms on this tile. If you do it like this will make sure that this will continue to fill up. Let me go on super speed here. It'll make sure this will continue to fill up until the point that the vent will be blocked because this is already filled up as much as we need to. So this is now up at about 500 kilograms, or at least it'll be there in just a second. And once that's entirely filled up, the vent will turn off because there's no reason to add more water. So there we go. So hydro sensor makes it very simple to create liquid locks here if you wanted to assure you're getting enough water. Now if there's any other gases or anything in here, they won't be transferring sides because the liquid is going to block it. So we have carbon dioxide down here. You might have oxygen or something out here, but the 2 sides are not going to mix if you do it that way. Alright, eventually you're going to want more power sources than just manual generators. This is a really common thing that I see people falling into in terms of a trap. So the next most common power source is usually going to be coal. So let's say you build a few coal generators, and I'll talk about this a lot more, or rather I already did in another video about managing your power wires. So if you want more information about that, I definitely already have that done. But the idea with coal generators is you probably, or really any power generators, you want to put them on this heavy watt wire, connect it to a transformer, have that transformer connect to everything else. The reason why is, let me get rid of these other power sources, by the way. The reason why is The heavy watt wire is very expensive and it can't run through walls, and there's all kinds of other issues with it. It's better if you can run with these smaller wires and connect all of your stuff via these smaller wires. But the problem that we have here, it's good that we're generating power without duplicant time, at least not that much. All they need to do is bring coal here. But the issue is that our batteries are full. There's no reason to have these coal generators continue to run because they're going to burn our coal really quickly. And we'll eventually run out and have no power, and then things will spiral. So a very simple way to deal with this is use a smart battery. So this is a battery that is capable of putting out an automation signal depending on how full it is. So once we have the smart battery here, we're going to connect it up to the same heavy watt wire, and I'm going to run some automation wire into these coal generators. And the way this works is once the battery is filled up to a certain degree, I'm going to set these to 80-20 initially. This is basically the range in which you want to keep the battery charged, and it'll send a signal to turn these things on if it's not happy with these values. So right now it's at about 10%. It's going to want to charge itself up to about 80 before it turns everything off. So it's going to continue to charge, and then once it hits that 80 mark, it's going to turn all the coal generators off, meaning that we are only burning coal when we actually need power. Let me raise the threshold here, or rather, let me connect up some more power consumers. We'll hook our shipping back up here. Reset our timer. There we go. So now we're using more power. Once it drops down to the threshold that you set, which is about 20%, it's going to turn back on and start burning more coal to get power. This is a really great way to get coal power, or really any type of power, without just burning through the resource endlessly. And this is one of the hidden things in the game that is extremely strong, almost a necessity, honestly, in order to complete it, but I don't really mention that anywhere. But yeah, very helpful piece of automation, both a battery and a sensor all in one. Okay, another common issue, especially early in the game and around mid-game when you start running out of some of your starter resources, is you might not notice that there's a problem going on in your base that you could easily detect with automation and let you know that there's a problem. One of which could be something like, let's say you start to run out of oxygen because maybe you ran out of algae or something like that. Ideally, you'd want to be tracking it over here so that you know how much you have, but you might have your focus taken away by something else and forget. So let's say we're running too low on oxygen and we need to know when that's a problem. So let's invest a little bit into some automation to tell us that. So I'm going to start with an Atmo sensor. This again just detects the air pressure that's near me. And I want to connect it up to an automated notifier. I did show this on the slide a little bit earlier. So let's throw this up here. And this automated notifier is something that you can customize to put an alert in the UI whenever it is set to a certain condition. So let's say we want our Atmo sensor to turn green. This automated notifier will send me a notification if it's green, by the way. So let's say if I want it to send a notification when it's below, like, I don't know, 900 grams of oxygen or something like that. You probably want to put this Atmo sensor somewhere away from your duplicants, but at least close enough that it's representative of the air that they're breathing. So if we have this, let's set up our notification to say, like, hey, low oxygen, and you could do some stuff like make a noise, pause the game. You could make it zoom in on where that is, so that if that does happen, we will get the notification. So we have about 1,000 grams of oxygen right now, but running below 900 is kind of getting a little sketchy. So let me do some debug cheats here to simulate what it would be like if we had breathed a whole bunch of this air already. So now we're down to about 550. This should definitely set off the Atmo sensor, which should definitely do something with the notifier. And let's say I'm looking at the totally opposite end of the map. Here we go. I'm looking down at our liquid lock, and it's going to be like, hey, you have some low oxygen. This is a good way to monitor problems that might be going on in your base. And the combination between these... Liera is not happy with our setup that we created earlier. There we go. It's going to be very unhappy with the oxygen level, and it's going to let you know, like, hey, you need to do something about your oxygen right now. Maybe you need to add more algae distillers, or sorry, oxygen diffusers. Maybe you need to add more of those. Maybe you need to switch on to a different thing, but at least you'll have more time by doing it this way, rather than noticing when your duplicants are already suffocating. Okay, let's talk about some automation related to ranching. I do have an entire video about this, by the way, so you can check that out if you want more information. But the basics of ranching is that these critters are going to produce resources that are going to be very useful, especially the hatches. They will produce coal, so that's going to be helpful for our power. And also, when they evolve into their next stage of life, they will turn into meat and give us a delicious meal. There's a couple ways to optimize this, though. If you're ever ranching, what's going to happen is these will start to lay eggs. So let's get a hatch egg, which is not alphabetized, of course, which is lovely. Once the egg drops in here, you can see that they will start getting bothered by that, and their reproduction rate will slow down, and they will stop laying eggs because there's too many eggs in here. So what I'm going to do is automatically ship the eggs out, and then those eggs are going to be moved to another room to eventually hatch and have this big overflow room that is just crammed with a ton of hatches. These ones are going to be cramped and they won't lay more eggs, but that's fine. Because all these are for is to replenish our population of ones that we actually want to care for. This room can only really handle 6 hatches at a time. You can see how much space each critter needs, by the way. It needs 12 cells before they are crowded or confined. So we need to assure that 6 hatches are always in here, but let's say a couple of hatches die from old age or whatever. Now we're only at 4, and I'm going to have to remember to have my duplicants go wrangle this or like move it into the other room or something like that. And I don't want to have to do that. I'd rather have my duplicants do it when it's time. The problem is that there's not any automation that comes off of this. It's going to tell me, hey, I need more critters in here. So let's use a couple of other tools. Let's use a critter sensor, which is going to detect how many eggs or critters are in a certain room. So if this is ever below 6, then it's going to send a green signal, turning something else on that's going to allow duplicants to bring hatches back into this room. So I want to make this match the exact number that's on here and have it say below. So if we're ever below this, then I'm saying, I need something, help me out. And what we're going to do to connect this up to is we're going to use a critter pickup and we're going to put it into our overflow room. This critter pickup is going to say, I want to take every hatch in this room and move it somewhere that's actually asking for it. But I only want my duplicant to be doing this if another room actually needs it. So we're going to wire up the critter sensor to the critter pickup so that whenever this is turned on, this duplicant's going to come over here and start wrangling hatches and moving them from one room to the other. Here's the arrow moving it in here. Now there's 5. There's going to be someone else that's going to bring a hatch into here. There we go. Now there's 6. Now this will start being red, and this will not be asking to move critters anymore because there's no rooms that need it anymore. So this is an easy way to assure that your stables in which that you're actually feeding and taking care of these critters are constantly maintained with the population that you want. Alright, this problem is going to take a little bit to set up, so stick with me for a bit. Let's say we're growing bristle blossoms. The reason you'd want to do this is because it's very common to have ice biomes on your map that grows a whole bunch of sleet wheat and stuff. So it's really nice to get in there and get access to the sleet wheat that grows naturally so you don't have to spend a bunch of resources and cool water and stuff like that for the sleet wheat. But one of the issues with the bristle blossoms is that it has a body temperature expectation between 5 and 30 C. So what I'll see a lot is people will be like, okay, I need a new water source for this because we're eventually going to run out of water. So they'll find something like this and they'll say, oh, nice, there's salt water here. I could get a setup that will turn the salt water into regular water, and that'll be awesome. The problem is that the salt water is very hot. It will definitely cause your bristle blossoms to stop growing, and it may tank your entire colony because you will now not have a food source that you are very dearly depending on. So that issue is definitely something that we need to address. And let's say we can't really find any other sources of water. So what I've built so far is a little caveman-y setup to create cool water. This is a bunch of cool water here, but I want to keep this cool water in this setup because it means we can also cool other water at the same time. So what I have inside here is a bunch of bins at pretty low capacity asking for ice, and that's going to be a side effect of us digging into this biome and getting access to this sleet wheat. I don't want to dig out the whole biome because I want the sleet wheat to keep growing, But as I'm creating these little tunnels through here, I might be able to pick off little bits of ice here and there. We can use that to keep this water cool. And that'll be one source of water. So let's first of all, well, the source of water will be that the ice will eventually melt and turn into water. So the first thing we can do is set up a liquid pump up here, but only turn on the liquid pump if we're starting to get too full. So I'm going to use a hydro sensor, connect it up to the pump. We'll connect the pump up to power, by the way. There we go. And I'm going to set it to, if this is ever above like 500 kilograms, and I'm saying like above is when I want this to turn on because everything is getting too full. I'm going to turn this on and we'll pump it into these tanks so that we have a regular water source here. Melting this ice might not be enough, and we also need some kind of heating element to continue to assure that this water is at a certain temperature to make sure that melting the ice actually happens pretty well. So what we can do with this saltwater geyser that we have over here is it's pumping out very hot water, 95°C. I have this all coming through some insulated pipes, and it's eventually going to arrive at the place that we're going to cool it, which is right down here. So what we can do is set something up so that when we have the salt water coming in, we can have it run through some radiant pipes and just kind of run through here like that. And we're going to make sure that this salt water cools down enough before it can be integrated into this system with a couple of tools. So the first thing, obviously, is if we're going to have the salt water turn into regular water, we need a desalinator. But I don't want to have the water just run straight into the desalinator. I'd rather have it cooled off before it goes into the desalinator and then into the liquid reservoir. So let's do that. Well, actually, we could do it a couple of different ways. One way is we could turn it into water first and then cool that very hot water. The issue is that the desalinator is then going to be a little bit of a too big of a heat source, but we might be able to help that out, actually. Let's just do it that way. So I'll put some metal tiles here on top of the desalinator to help keep it cool. It'll be bordering this very cold water down here. And then down at the bottom, let's run it through the desalinator first. So I'm going to run it through with some insulated tiles and then down into this area via insulated pipe. So now we've got this very hot salt water coming. It's going to get turned into regular water after going through the desalinator. Let me hook this up to power as well. There we go. By the way, our coal generators that we created earlier in this video are still pushing everything, so there you go. But I want to make sure that this water doesn't leave this area and head back up into the reservoir until it's cold enough. So I'm going to use a couple of automation tools. One of which is going to be a liquid shutoff. This is basically something that you can send an automation signal to in order to allow water to pass through it or not. Or I guess any liquid, not necessarily just water. So I'm going to hook this up to power, and what we're going to put right next to it, the flow on this pipe is going to be coming in this direction. So I want it to go into the liquid shutoff and then out, but only when it's ready to come out. So I'm going to make sure that it comes out at the right temperature and then eventually have it flow up into these tanks. But the tool that we're going to use is a liquid pipe thermosensor. There's a whole category of sensors that attach to pipes and just evaluate stuff that's inside those pipes. This one's going to check the temperature of whatever's in this pipe right now, and it can turn something on or off depending on what the packet or what the temperature of that packet is right now. So this, I'm going to say, we only want it to go through and head up into the tank if it's anywhere below like 30°C, because that's the maximum that these bristle blossoms can take. You might even want to go a little bit lower than that. So I'm only going to send a green signal if it's below like 25, let's say that. So the whole setup here, we're going to have the very hot salt water come through. It'll get turned into regular water. Let me destroy this like pipe here. It's a little bit distracting. There we go. Turns into regular water, and you can see it's coming in here very hot, 89 degrees, whatever this is. It's going to snake through the water, and it will eventually land at this thermosensor to check and say, hey, is the water inside here actually cool enough to let it go through? Once it finally is, and you can see the temperature of the water here, it's at 26, 25, and there we go. It eventually gets let through. Hey, we have low oxygen. Let me get rid of this, by the way. Very useful in practice, but not while we're filming videos. So, now that it is getting some packets through, you can see those packets were below 25, so it's going to get let through. In turn, this is also going to heat up this water, which will encourage the ice to melt a little bit faster. And that's a good way to make sure that you have very hot water coming in, but it won't eventually be touching our bristle blossoms because we have this set of automation in here, we have this whole ice cooler set up. There's a lot of different ways that you could do this, but mixing hot and cold waters together is a really good way to get the temperature to something that you really want without spending a lot of power or infrastructure on it. These are only some of the examples of automation setups that you could be using in your game to either save power, increase effective duplicant time, or just to save your own attention for more important things. Either way, I hope these setups and explanations give you a good understanding of automation, but note that we only covered a fraction of what's available in Oxygen Not Included. There are a lot more things that I think are worth knowing about, but might be too complicated for a video that's just about automation basics, so we'll save that for another video, and feel free to check it out if you wanted to learn more. As usual, drop a comment if I can help you out with anything, and let's get that completion percentage up. Until the next video, have a great day, and I'll see you soon.